Sorry, Mr. Tushnet, por problemas de conectividad. Martín, this here. Martín, ¿tendrías la amabilidad, por favor? ¿Me escuchas? Sí, ¿tendrías la amabilidad, por favor, de empezar? Hubo un problema técnico que ya luego te detallaré cuáles fueron los motivos fundamentales.
Okay.
That's right. Sorry.
Okay. Vale. Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Gueda. And I currently work as an official collaborator in the cultural activities of the shared culture, human rights, and the Faculty of Social Science of the University of Buenos Aires. I'm very happy because we have with us renowned personality at a global level. I'm referring to Professor Mark Tushnet, a constitutional law professor who kindly accepted to give a lecture for a cultural purpose. Dr. Mark Tushnet is an emeritus professor at the Harvard Law School and a great expert in the field of constitutional law and theory, including constitutional law compilation. The topic of the conference and debate is reflection on of for presentation, after which we will give the floor to Professor Luis David Fernandez Zambranos, who will make some comments within a reasonably time frame. Dear Dr. Mark Tushnet, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and now you have the floor to begin.
Thank you very much. First, just I want to make sure that I'm coming through clearly. Is that everything's fine? Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation to give this talk. Ideal in ideal circumstances, I'd be able to do it in Buenos Aires, which is a place I've never been but would love to get to. But of course, circumstances make that impossible. What I'm going to talk about is essentially constitutionalism and democracy in general, or constitutionalism and participatory democracy in general. And the first point is, why should there be any question about constitutionalism and participatory democracy? After all, we're interested mostly in constitutional democracy, and democracy is almost by definition participatory in the acts of voting and political organizing. So I think the real issue is the choice between, or how much you will have of, direct democracy and representative democracy. Now, most of my talk is going to be devoted to direct democracy, but I do want to say a bit about sort of encouraging participation in a representative democracy systems. So, for example, as I've mentioned, the core aspects of participation in representative democracy are voting and participating in political activity, and in particular, participating in political parties. So we might want to think about whether there should be policies that encourage voting and participation in political parties. As to the first, encouraging voting, there are sort of some obvious things to do, like removing obstacles in the way of voting, locating polling places where they're convenient, adopting methods of even secure online voting and the like. There's also the possibility of mandatory voting, which exists in, among other places, Belgium and Australia. There, you're required to vote. There's a small fine if you don't vote. Typically, you have the opportunity to vote for none of the above, which is an important feature of mandatory voting. And on the whole, things seem to work reasonably well where you have mandatory voting. It's, as I note, not common, but it's a policy option that probably should be considered. Encouraging participation in political parties is more difficult because you have to give incentives to people to participate rather than to go to a party meeting rather than go to a movie. And it's not clear exactly how you could do that directly. You might do it indirectly by giving parties incentives to draw people in. Historically, the way in many places, the way to do that was for the political parties to say to the people, look, if you join us and work with us, we will give you jobs, basically patronage systems. Now, those have fallen out of favor for a variety of mostly good reasons. But it's probably worth thinking about ways of giving parties incentives to increase the participation of ordinary people in the parties beyond the mere act of voting for the party's candidates. That's all I have to say. My thinking about this latter is very underdeveloped, and so that's all that I have to say about encouraging participation in a system of representative democracy. I want to turn now to direct democracy, and I'll start with a point that I will make again in a moment, which is pretty much everyone everywhere thinks that a well-designed constitutional democracy will combine representative democracy through parliaments with some opportunities for direct democracy. But many people are skeptical about having extensive forms or many opportunities for direct democracy. Now, direct democracy, just as an example, there's a body called the Venice Commission, which is essentially a think tank advisory committee to the democratic governments in Europe that issues advisory reports on constitutional developments and, importantly, issues reports on general topics. And when you look at their reports on these general topics, the Venice Commission is very skeptical about direct democracy. For reasons that I'll get to in just a moment, they can't oppose it overall, but they strongly prefer representative democracy. Now, what are the modes of direct democracy? Well, first, there are many forms. I'll mention three. First are what the Europeans call, and I don't know whether this term is used in Argentina, an imperative mandate. That is a mechanism by which a parliamentary representative commits to taking a position on a particular issue and is subject to penalty if she votes against this. So ordinarily, the voters in the district will, in the US terms, instruct the representative to vote in favor of, say, environmental protection of a particular sort. And if the representative doesn't do so, maybe she'll automatically lose her office. That's the imperative mandate. Second, more common today, actually quite common today, are referendums. And that's what I'm going to focus my remarks on. There are many kinds of referendums. I'll deal just with the general idea of a referendum to develop a particular policy position. And then more recently, there have been interesting ideas circulating and adopted in some places about citizen assemblies with either or both agenda setting authority or lawmaking authority. Agenda setting authority, the citizen assembly convenes and comes up with some policy proposal and then advises the parliament that it should take some action recommended by the citizen assembly. Much less common are assemblies with lawmaking authority, though there are some, I'll mention one later on, but low-level participatory budgeting at the municipal level can be a form of a citizen assembly with lawmaking authority. The locality, the city, the town, the neighborhood convenes a citizen assembly to determine how to allocate the funds that are available. And whatever the citizen assembly does at the local level will become the allocation. Even more interesting and more speculative, the idea of, instead of having elections, random selection of officials. This is done, again, quite rarely, but the idea would be, instead of having the effort of elections, you convene a body that is composed of randomly chosen people who have to be compensated adequately. So, and there are lots of design issues, but there's increasing interest in participation through random selection. Now, why are there skeptics about direct democracy? As I mentioned, the Venice Commission opposes imperative mandates and has pretty strong best practices rules about referendums. I can't oppose referendums entirely because they're so well established in Europe, with Switzerland being the usual example of a nation where referendums happen all the time. Important policies are decided in Switzerland. I don't know the statistics, but 3 major referendums a year is not uncommon. Well, why is there skepticism about this? Well, the reason is that direct democracy is said to lead to a combination of uninformed decision-making. So consider a referendum campaign where there's a proposal, the current bad example or current example that people use is the Great Britain's exit from the European Union. And it's framed as a yes or no decision. And the campaign for yes or no is, like many political campaigns, overly simplified, doesn't expose what the real issues are. In the United Kingdom, it was pretty clear that the proponents of exit substantially understated and misrepresented what the likely effects were going to be of leaving the European Union. So you get a simplified, you get a campaign that offers overly simplified messages to voters who are mostly not terribly well informed, and the campaigns don't do much to inform them more. So that's one, uninformed decision making. The other is a lack of deliberation. That is, because at the end of the process there's a just yes or no vote, you don't have a back and forth among supporters and opponents or people who are uneasy about the United Kingdom being in the European Union, and people who think that it's basically a good idea, but maybe there should be some modifications. You don't have that kind of dialogue that can lead to modification of the policy proposal and its improvement. Now, I want to note here, I'm going to mostly be defending referendums against these two charges of uninformed voting and lack of deliberation. But it's important to note in framing this that there's an idealization of representative democracy here. Representative democracy is not always terribly well informed and not always terribly deliberative. As the latter, one important consideration is the role of political parties. If the governing party wants something, its proposal will mostly and ordinarily go through with only the appearance of deliberation. The party leaders will say to the members of the party in the parliament, here's what our platform is. You're members of the party, you have to support the party. Now, I want to note that before they do that, they will probably consult with the parliamentarians, and the proposal might be changed in light of some of the concerns that some parliamentarians have. But as I'll note, something like that can happen in connection with referendums as well. And so you shouldn't, just on the imperative mandate idea, many political parties will impose formal or informal discipline on people elected as members of the party who don't support important policy programs. They'll expel the person from the party, or they will, this is not uncommon in the United Kingdom, they'll tell them, look, you no longer have any chance of becoming a minister in the government because you haven't gone along with the party. So those are sort of not quite imperative mandates, but they're close enough to it. And on the knowledge point, elected representatives of parties don't always know much about what they're voting for, except that their party leaders support it or oppose it. And that's good enough for them, as it often is for voters in referendums. So just as I turn to referendums, you have to keep in mind the reality of what parliamentary democracy is like, not an ideal vision of parliamentary democracy. So now let me take up direct democracy. As I noted earlier, everybody agrees that you're going to have some combination of representative democracy through parliaments with some opportunities for direct democracy. One question is, when will direct democracy come into play? And I have here, I'll list three possibilities. I'm sure there are others. First, there's widespread agreement among party leaders across the political spectrum to leave something out of political contention. Just, we're not going to deal with this, coupled with citizen demand to do something about the problem. So citizens say, look, Parliament's not doing something about it. We have to do something on our own. And the reason Parliament's not doing anything about it is, again, because across the political spectrum, party leaders don't want to address the problem. This often, I don't know, often, it sometimes occurs in connection with economic programs where party leaders agree for a variety of reasons to impose austerity programs that the public doesn't like. Okay. Now, I should note here in this example, in this first possibility, there is some sort of disconnect between party elites and voters, because by definition, there's citizens' demand to do something, and it's an elected democracy. So you would think that some party leader or some political entrepreneur would say, look, I'm going to run on a platform to do what you folks want politicians to do. And if there's sufficient citizen demand, that person will win. And so the conditions for this agreement to leave something out of political contention and citizen demand, those should be unusual conditions. Here, I'm going to use an example from sort of across the mountains from you, from Chile. I'll refer to this a couple of times. The pressure for constitutional reform in Chile, which was initially met with resistance from the right and the left because they basically didn't see good outcomes from constitutional revision one way or the other. But then it was taken, this pressure for constitutional reform was taken advantage of by politicians. Okay, so that's the first possibility. Citizen demand for something that politicians don't want to do. Second, party leaders, particularly in a governing party or a governing coalition, find some issue too difficult to resolve because of divisions within the party. And so they shunt it off to a referendum to avoid taking responsibility for a decision. This analysis is developed actually in connection with ideas of constitutional review by the American political scientist Mark Graber, and he uses the example of abortion policy in the United States in the 1970s. But abortion policy generally, actually, around the world has the same flavor. That is, major political parties find themselves divided internally about what to do about abortion policy, and so they don't. They think something has to be done, but they don't want to do it, so they put it to a referendum. And then finally, party leaders want to get some special legitimacy from endorsement by the public compared to a party majority in parliament. This often takes the form of referendums to enhance, in particular, the power of a president. In Latin America, as you know, the persistent difficulty in constitutional design has been excessive presidential power. Presidents who want to increase their power even more will find it convenient to say, look, we went to the people, they wanted me to have this greater power. Of course, it's worth noting that if you go to a referendum, you risk losing. And again, Chile is an example, actually twice. General Pinochet put himself on the ballot, basically, expecting to win, and suddenly he lost. And then more recently, the constitutional revision was on the ballot, and it was rejected for complicated reasons. Okay, so those are three reasons why people use referendums. Now, let me talk more about these features of direct democracy that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to use referendums as my primary example and then say a bit about citizen assemblies. My overall argument is that direct democracy is often as deliberative as representative democracy. The reason is that you have to look at the entire process by which referendums are developed and put to the people, not just at the moment of decision. Yes, at the moment of decision, the answer is yes or no. And in some of the run-up to the day of the election, there'll be misleading political advertising. But you have to think about what happened before you got to that point. And also you have to be aware of the possibility that political parties organize in referendums just as they do in elections for representatives. And so if the political parties are misleading in a referendum campaign, the odds are they're going to be misleading in a campaign for elected representatives. So now consider how a referendum develops. Somebody, an NGO, an interest group, a non-government organization, a political leader or a political party comes up with a policy idea. Typically responding to some social problem or economic problem. They publicize their policy idea and public discussion ensues. There are newspaper editorials and commentary published in prominent newspapers and in the media. The proposal, and so there are these discussions, deliberation, you could call it. The proposal is modified in light of discussions and eventually becomes the subject of a campaign to get on the ballot. Once it's on the ballot, and I should note that as the discussion can lead to modification of the initial proposal into a form that becomes the ballot proposition. Once it's on the ballot, discussion continues with ordinary participants in political discussions weighing in, parties, news media, ordinary people in bars and restaurants, the same kinds of things that happen in campaigns for representative office. And then it's voted on. Okay, there's the yes or no decision. If it fails, this is, I think, so there are two possibilities. It could fail or it could succeed. If it fails, that's not the end of the story. Proponents go back to the drawing board, often, not always, but often, and they come back with some substitute. Maybe propose legislation to be adopted by Parliament rather than a new referendum. Think here of what's going on in Chile right now. The constitutional reform referendum failed. There's now a legislative process of constitutional reform, which I would note, I've been something of an observer of that process, is I think likely to come up with a constitution that's not going to be dramatically different from the one that was rejected. It'll be different cosmetically for a variety of reasons. But the core things that people, the core of the ideas that people were most nervous about are most likely to be preserved in the parliamentary constitutional reform. So, referendum fails, people start over. If the referendum succeeds, that's not the end of it either. The policy has to be implemented through ordinary legislation, and that provides opportunities for modification and taking into account complexities that were overlooked and so on. That's sort of what's happening, has happened over the past, whatever it is, 5 years in the United Kingdom. There are more steps and the like, but the important point here is that this process, the process of direct democracy through referendums, isn't dramatically different from the process associated with ordinary parliamentary legislation. There's deliberation, There's reframing and modification and proposals and the like. These things happen sometimes at different points in the timeline than they would for ordinary legislation. Sometimes, indeed, they happen after the vote rather than before the vote, but they do happen. Finally, a word about citizen assemblies and the like, including, as I mentioned, participatory budgeting, which has been reasonably successful in many places. Typically, citizen assemblies are designed to exclude direct participation by the political parties. And that, as I'll note in a moment, can be a problem. But they are designed to be representative of the population as a whole. And so, in principle, they ought to have a composition that roughly tracks political divisions within the nation. So again, let me use the example of Chile. The Constituent Assembly was convened under rules that said no proposal could go forward unless it had 2/3 support from the Constituent Assembly. Everybody, when they did that design, everybody assumed that the right and the left would each have at least 1/3 representation in the Constituent Assembly. And so the right and the left would have veto powers. And that was thought to be a good thing. And again, notice these were people who were affiliated with the political parties, but who weren't candidates of the parties. Now, what happened in Chile was that these expectations were defeated. Everybody expected the right to get more than 1/3 of the votes, the seats, and a veto over a proposal, but it fell just short. I think it ended up with 32% or something like that, instead of 27% instead of 33%. I think that's what the numbers were. And so it lost its power to veto, and then the thing went off the rails. I haven't seen a good explanation for why the right was underrepresented in the Constituent Assembly. My best guess is that it was just random variation of the sort that of something that can occur in any election, and it just came out badly from the random variation. It came out badly from the designer's point of view. Okay, but so again, you exclude the political parties, but you have representative body that's representative of the people as a whole, and so you ought to get representation roughly the same as you would get in a parliamentary setting. But there's one big difference. One feature of the formal exclusion of parties is that they don't have automatic buy-in to the results. They can oppose the results. Without seeming to go back on bargains they made, even if the participants in the assembly thought that they were accommodating party interests. So here, the example that I know best is Iceland, where you had a citizen assembly that came up with a pretty good constitutional reform, and it had to be approved by Parliament, and the parties hadn't participated, and so they just sat on the proposal until the impulse weakened crisis passed. I should note that constitutional reform remains on the agenda in Iceland, mostly because one minor political party keeps pressing forward, and it's got some support within one of the other major parties. Okay, so citizen assemblies can run into difficulties. They will be deliberative and they will be well informed, but they may not have the appropriate political support. I'm coming to my conclusion. One solution, which people are toying with, is to give the output of the citizen assembly automatic legal force. You don't have to get approval by the parliament. You don't have to get it approved in a referendum. It would be, I don't know how much you're familiar with it, but it would be like a jury verdict in the United States. You have this randomly assorted set of people. They come in, they hear the evidence, they deliberate, and they make a judgment of guilty or innocent, or liable or not liable, and that has legal force. You could do that with a citizen assembly. Most constitutions would have to be amended to allow that, of course. There's an interesting experiment going on in Belgium with a limited version of a citizen assembly with automatic legal force. And I think it went into effect maybe under a year ago. And it'll be interesting to see how well it works. Okay, so my time's more than up. I'll conclude with a simple observation. Direct democracy is here to stay in some form, and that's probably a good thing. Now, since I'm addressing a convening of students and law students and future activists in public life, the task for you in the future is twofold. First, to make sure that the mechanisms of direct democracy are well designed. So thinking about best practices in ways that's not motivated, as the Venice Commission's recommendations are, by skepticism about direct democracy. If you wanted to make this work well and you like the idea, here are what some good practices would be. And second, at least from my perspective, think creatively about expanding the opportunities for direct participatory democracy to widen public participation in lawmaking as a vindication of the fundamental impulse that lies behind democratic constitutionalism itself. Okay, again, thank you for the opportunity to provide you with these thoughts, and I look forward to the comments and the ensuing discussion.
Well, very good, very
Thank
good.
you, Professor Tushnet. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Tushnet. Luis David, start, please.
That's right. That's right. Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody present during this opportunity, especially Professor Mark Tushnet, Emeritus Professor of Law, Harvard Law School, from granting us an valuable space of his time to listen, converse, and debate of mind ideas surrounding the reflections on interrelation between American constitutionalism and participatory democracy. Through this gig, the platform primarily intuitive and informed students, the community of the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, but also for the general public interested in expanding their knowledge on these areas of analysis and debate. It is truly an honor for me to have you evaluate presence in the space. Therefore, in work like to publicly express. Thank you very much, dear college and Professor Mark Tushnet. I would like to focus on the term democracy and analyze in the premises in the lay on the understand and the validation in the social, political, legal, etc. Regards in that sense, many stars from the premise that democracy acts as system and the government should develop upon certain principles that are strongly present in the political science narrative in many parts of the world. in that regard, in be considered only the renowned author in the Latin American and Anglo-Saxon academic, such as George Dalch, John Rawls, Guillermo Donnell, and Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, um, what can easily identify these fundamental principles that ensure in existence, effectiveness, and efficiency. One, that principle of enlightened understanding. Citizens must have access to the information, education, and knowledge necessary to make informed and reasonable political decisions. Two, that's principle of the agenda or agenda or control. The system must have the ability to influence policy formulation and public agenda. They should not subject to the imposition of the unilateral or exclusive political agenda. That principle of the governing control. The system must have the means to control and hold their leaders. Account that this includes accountability, transparency, and mechanisms to limit the power of the political leaders. That principle of effectivity participation. The citizens must have real and meaningful opportunities to participate in the political process, express their opinions, make decisions, and control their leaders. Um, that principle of protection of human rights, O'Donnell considers, and democracy should ensure the protection of fundamental human rights. This implies guaranteeing equality, no discrimination, human dignity, and the protection of the individual freedoms. Six, for example, the principle of pluralism, political participation. O'Donnell emphasizes need for the pluralistic uh, and diverse society that allows political participation from different actors and groups. This includes freedom on expression, association, and assembly, as well as the inclusion of minorities and protection of their rights. That principle of solidarity and cooperation, Pérez Esquivel promoted solidarity and cooperation among people and nations and essential values for democracy. This involves working together to address global challenges and build a more just and peaceful societies. That's principle, that's principle of the rights to resistance. Persistent defends the right of resistance to resist and oppose oppression and human rights violation. This implies a legitimate uh, exercise of social protest and defense of fundamental rights. These are among other additional pillars or principles that are also important to consider. Um, However, as we can see, many of the principles are far from being the fulfilled in the majority of the international political and economic scene due to various factors related to practices of political and civil authorities, whose consequence completely distance idea that we currently live a democratic system in a world or continent where many countries are governed by media oligopolies, economic asymmetries, low levels of cultural consumptions by citizens, um, but above all, where human rights are savagely violated and named on money and power. There is no doubt that democracy as a system of representation in the far from being an objective reality. Therein lies the reason why some of the believe that democracy future possibility because it did not properly exist in antiquity. Societies were not symmetrical or arbitrary back then, and they still remain unequal, asymmetrical, and arbitrary today. However, that does not mean in canon exist. If we define the condition under which in would exist, democracy become a potential future. In crucial to keep in mind that while there are diverse constitutional narratives throughout history and across continents that speak of democracy, human rights, and citizen participation, it is clear in practice that they are far from being efficiently implemented. Nevertheless, it's necessary to consider the existence of democratic values that can circulate more analysis by certain political or military forces that do not appreciate their development and flourishing in our modern communities. Under this premise, its emphasis is most important on urgently and unpostponably fostering the democratization of culture among citizens from all institutional sector. We must excessively promote the stimulation of critical thinking and interdisciplinary cultural theories, making self-directed learning the supreme goal on the educational system where wide. It is essential to promote ethical thinking, the effective communication skill for foster diversity and inclusion, and insisted a lot for nation from early stages of the development to create reasonable condition for the healthy democrat and climate in the coming years. They are received that should be internalized by all members of society regardless of their origin, economic position, or ideological stance. Real and conscious change is everybody's responsibility, not just the governments and their political actors. The challenge in I believe is to seek individual and institutional strategies for these to flourish with efficient effectiveness and resilience against the passage of time. Secondly, I would like to focus on the 1913 constitutional reforms in the philosophical and legal realms, offering the following historical introspection on the democracy as inclusion within the classical tradition of the constitutional liberalism. It is no secret to anyone moderately educated in the political theory and the history that liberalism as political movement is more in England and violent, bloody, and revolutionary response against absolutist monarchy. I mean to assert the presence of civil and political rights and to grant merchants of that time of the significant presence and control in British Parliament. Figures um, like to John Locke and Oliver Cromwell easily come to mind when we turn our attention to this crucial aspect. One Bill of Rights en 1900, 1689, 1689 year, also known as the Declaration of Rights, established the fundamental rights and freedom of the British people and limited the power of the monarch. Some of the rights and the freedom protected by the Bill of Rights include freedom of the speech, the right to fair trial, the prohibition of taxation without Parliament's consent, and the prohibition of cruel and excessive punishment. Um, Furthermore, the Bill of the Rights asserted that Parliament must convene regularly and could only be dissolved by order of Parliament itself. The law established the supremacy of Parliament and the separation of power in the British government, which had a significant influence of the development of liberal democracy worldwide. We must understand that British Parliament was generally composed of the wealthy individuals representing a selected minority. This was partly to the fact that a right to vote was limited to those who owned a certain amount of property, excluding a majority of a population, especially on the working class and women. Additionally, many members of the parliament were part of the nobility or bourgeoisie, which granted them access to the education, culture, and political connection necessary to hold public office. However, as the 19th century progressed, there was growing social pressure on the Spanish to rights to vote and allow greater representation of the population and the parliament, eventually leading to a series of significant political reforms. While there were some legal modifications, as, such as Reform Act of 1832 and Representation of the People Act of 1867. The latter was not enough to establish an inclusive democratic system with the large disadvantaged majorities in the Orden books, seen in the merging of liberal ideas and their constitutional legalization, there was no democratic system that included the large disadvantaged majorities. If we talk about including women and births of the right to suffrage, then we must take into account of the following. In England, is as in United States, female suffrage only became prince in the early decades of the 20th century. After long struggle against conservative powers, that is to see. It's too more than 200 years. Doesn't happen with influence in the inherited from the Constitution of the Courts of Cadiz in 1820 years in this part of the world, which inspired to bear to bear of the many constitutions in Latin America under of liberal sign. The first liberal political constitution were inspired by very important liberal tradition, but they did not in the any way make the governing system that implemented them inclusive of the large majorities. That was a phenomenon in the 20th century. Thus, as many examples of this in different parts of the world and the different stages of the history. Therein lies the reason why I insist on the separating in the weak front of the chart, appealing to the principle of the primacy of the reality over idealistic or utopian principle, leading to idea of the seeking the separation between in the inclusive or the participatory democratic, the system and participatory democratic values. Um, this is where I cling to idea of a more problematic relationship between democracy and liberalism and consequence of the practice. As we know, the system of democratic values in different parts and paradox and development in the modern countries it is not sufficient to build a democratic system and the laws for the comprehensive development of the human beings. For my perspective, that is one of the most urgent challenges and to overcome. Moving from democratic values to the consolidation of democracy as system of government. On the other hand, I want to delve deep into the philosophical case, question of the liberalism frame, the within the gradual evolution on the constitutionalism in the Latin America. In order to understand whether in the can or cannot align with our realities. At this point, I must confess that I have always been in favor as an educator or professor in a higher educational institution that chooses to embrace science as driving for societal development, of avoiding unnecessary anachronisms in that sense, terms such as human freedom, freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, freedom of trade, perhaps dazzling in an era when it was believed that air was flat or the flat or that some rebel around the earth. Those do not seem reasonable to me in this era. For a long time, classical sociological tradition, thinking of authors like Emily Durkheim, even the most recent scientific research demonstrate that beings are not free because they have always been conditioned by culture, education, language, prejudices, economics, and idiosyncrasies of their time. Even before their birth, for example, obviously over the years, one can modify two ideas back of a linguistic foundation that they did not freely choose to incorporate into their means. In that same vein, it is necessary to revisit the idea that Locke's concept of freedom inspired by Thomas Aquinas through his foundation from the will dimension in the by specifically Aquinas developed idea that freedom of conscience is a fundamental aspect of human freedom, as human beings have the capacity to reason and discern what is true and what is false. According to Aquinas, freedom of the conscience implies that individuals have the right of the responsibility, um, follow their conscience in religious and moral matters, even if it means going against civil laws and popular opinion. Unfortunately, the idea of free will has long been surpassed by science. Alex Brands, an Australian philosopher who has written on various topics of philosophy of the mind, including free will, um, argue that free will in the confusion ambiguous idea in articulate life free will skepticism and meaning in the life. I argue that the concept of the free will is problematic because it's not clear what having free will would mean. Better maintains that free will is not necessary for morality, responsibility, or human dignity. In the same vein, Joshua Rings, an American neuroscience and philosophy, links towards the theory that free will is an illustration. Illustration. We argue that the brain makes this decision before we are conscious of having made them, and that our sense on the freedom in decision making may be the later contractation. Green argue that this should not be a shore of the despair of the Nigerians, but rather we should focus on the building more just a quality will we club society without relying on the notion of free will. Similarity, I find it very important to consider significance of the challenging classical ideas such as the separation of the powers and equality before the law because while they are concept with good intention, unfortunately their structures begin to run in the face of advances in the current science. In relation to later, there is a discussion about need for the powers of the state to separate like impermeable and autonomous bubbles to ensure that balance. I don't think that ever happened, nor should it happen. I believe that power should work collaboratively to address enormous challenges experienced by civil society, particularly democratic values and the respective countries. I think the problem is that many times the power cooperate or conspire against the delayed democratic values, putting the development of nations in serious trouble. As the power exists, there are many more that challenge these secularized ideas that invite to powerfully transform of legal land switch on our constitution in the American. We have been legitimized in our legal system for centuries in the name of the progress, practical reason, and scientific advancement. This does not mean denying their positive essence that still exists within their legal framework, such as social and cultural rights that seek a progress of human beings of the country. It means continuing to recognize what is worth preserving, what is truly good, and correcting what is bad or differs for our times, and even more so if we advocate for making our lives scenario for scientific advancement rather than metaphysics pursuit in our professions. Then, if time allows, I would like to address the tension between certain rights related to culture and environment, the versus property rights, the rights of religious minorities, and advancement of artificial intelligence and in and this moment. Well, hi, that's here for now. I am open to receiving criticisms and suggestions on matter. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you, Luis. Professor Tushnet, would you like a comment sometime? Has 5 minutes.
I actually thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Zambrano, for those interesting comments. I really don't have very much to add. I think my reaction to the comments was that it illustrated two things. First, the difference between our presentations illustrated sort of two aspects of how one does constitutional law. So one is I focused on matters of institutional design and implementation, which rest on assumptions about human capacity and human flourishing and the like. And Professor Zambrano focused on the latter, that is, more philosophical foundations for the very idea of democracy. Another way of putting it is, I took the idea of democracy for granted and was talking about how it could work out, how you could work it out. Professor Zambrano examined why we should think that constitutional democracy is a good thing in the first place in terms of human capacity. I just note that as again, as I put it, illustrating two different but complementary ways of thinking about constitutions. And I typically ordinarily think the way I express myself in my comments, and then read and reflect on the foundational kinds of things that Professor Zambrano talked about. I confess I didn't hear anything that I would disagree with in Professor Zambrano's presentation. I suppose the one footnote that I would add to my own presentation is that everything I had to say was set against a background of limitations on exercise of power pursuant to international human rights norms or fundamental human rights. And just my perspective on that was simply that that background exists with respect to both representative democracy and direct democracy, and so it doesn't have much direct bearing on what I was talking about. I think I'll stop with that. I could say a few more things, but I think that's probably enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. and Dr. Mark Tushnet, por esas palabras, by these words. One moment. Okay. Martín, ¿estás ahí, Martín? Quiero ver cómo está el tiempo para que no haya ningún problema con esto. Acá está. Ya. Bueno, a ver, vamos a ver cómo es el tiempo. Time. Ya. Sí, todavía podemos hacer cosas muy interesantes. A ver, we like. Ya. Okay. Sure. Thank you very much to Professor Mark Tushnet of the offerings. ¿Me está escuchando? Quiero saber si me está escuchando. Bueno, perfecto. Voy a empezar nuevamente. A ver, ya. Well, excuse me. Thank you very much to Professor Mark Tushnet for offering us very enlightening and interesting overview of the subject. In the response to his observation and opinions, and obligated to comment the following. The challenge posed by the advancement of the artificial intelligence to governments that base their works, the projects to constitutions that include democratic legal categories or that can help strengthen democratic values are a real dreadful for many people who understand that the right to culture education may be risked. I'm not saying that those legal categories will disappear from the legal framework or of our constitution, but rather that the way they are implemented in our society will be very different. Previously, going to a library, sitting down to read for hours, the making handwritten, some risks, relying heavily on memory and personal words was common practice. In educational system worldwide, occurs in stimulated areas of the brain such as retention, attention, concentration, memory, analysis, and interpretation for life. However, artificial intelligence has changed that way of the understanding and the operation acing the right to education for many inherently stimulates intellectual laziness. However, I believe in the ancient for university and schools worldwide to include courses on the philosophy, proper management, of artificial intelligence, observe branches that allow students to develop mental skill to make and the conscious and intelligence use of the information available on the web, exciting and to twist the basis and translating as human beings in the broad sense. In other words, to prevent the essence of education from being lost to widespread intellectual lesson that artificial intelligence can cause, and in its law of the stimulate more analysis, lucidity, and reason to properly through these technological advances. Further, in the is important to prevent. Eso por el momento quería comentar. Well, you have Mr. Mark Tushnet, the word, nuevamente, new word, for the comment and critic and sugerencia, cualquier novedad sobre Intelligent Artificial Constitutional Law in American Latin in Human Rights today in the world. The tried intelligent artificial, ¿cómo ve usted? ¿Cuál es su perspectiva? Your perspective of the advanced intelligent artificial in the constitutional law in the American Latin in United States, especialmente con los trabajos que van a ir desapareciendo. Well, I would like to thank Professor Mark Tushnet for his time dedicated to analyzing, discussing, and within and framework of the respect and tolerance. Since the experience has been wonderful, additional, and would like to know if you would agree. The Professor Mark Tushnet to collaborate with us in creating an collaborative publication, an article on test on the topic discussed during this digital meeting. In order to continue enriching the academic narrative and strengthening in the intellectual connection in our modern world. It would be a great honor for us to maintain communication with you and deeper into this topic to build a much better world for future generations. What is your opinion on this, dear colleagues and friends?
Well, so I'd be happy to continue the conversation, particularly in light of the aspirations that you describe about improving our understanding of how governance can make life better for people.
Okay, that's right, fantastic. Thank you very much for your response. We are delighted to continue collaboration once again and reiterate our infinite gratitude on behalf of all my colleagues from the faculty and rest assured that we will stay in touch for future academic and cultural activities. It is an honor as always, I would also like to thank Martin Ueda for his assistance with moderation. One day, we will be at the Harvard Law School to extend a warm hug to you and continue discussion or conversation these fascinating topics. Take care and huge hug to you and all your loved ones in the United States. Good night. Y thanks very much, estimado doctor Mark Tushnet.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Hola amigo, ¿qué tal?
Estoy con gripe. Estoy mal, mal.
No te preocupes. Yo también me quiero gripar.
No, sí, estoy mal. No puedo ni siquiera respirar. Pero al menos aguantamos 1 hora con 20 minutos, ¿eh?
No